Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. We move to the Kitab al-Luqata, the book of lost property items in this book of Sahih Muslim. Let's take this first chapter about picking up lost items from Zayd bin Khalid al-Juhani. He says, a man came to the Prophet asking him about the Luqata, and the Prophet replied, "I'rif عفاصها ووكاءها ثم عرفها سنة فإن جاء صاحبها وإلا فشأنك بها." He says you need to take note of its container and its tying string, and then announce the property for 1 year, that is 1 lunar year. If the owner comes and collects it, then so be it, otherwise it belongs to you. And then the man asked, فَضَالَّةُ الْغَنَمِ, what about a lost sheep or a stray sheep? The Prophet said, لَكَ أَوْ لِأَخِيكَ أَوْ لِلذِّئْبِ, it is either for you or for your brother or for the wolf. Then he says, فَضَالَّةُ الْإِبِلِ, what about the stray camel? The Prophet said, مَا لَكَ وَلَهَا مَعَهَا سِقَاؤُهَا وَحِذَاؤُهَا تَرِدُ الْمَاءِ وَتَأْكُلُ الشَّجَرِ حَتَّى يَلْقَاهَا رَبُّهَا. He says, what have you got to do with it? This camel has its belly and it has its feet. It comes to the water to drink and it eats the leaves of the tree until its master finds him. So we learn that you have to take note of the description of the lost item so that the owner, if he is the true owner, will be able to describe it perfectly. The hadith mentions the container and the tying string, but of course that is by way of an example. Otherwise, we say that the description must be well known so that you can test the owner. He says, announce it for a year, but the detail of how to announce it is not given to us, and the scholars have mentioned that you announce it in the place you found it. For the first week, announce it every day, then announce it monthly. If you find the lost item in an isolated place, like in a countryside, let's say, then announce it in the nearest village or town. And you can announce it using posters and advertisements in newspapers and so on. It's a flexible matter because the Sharia does not give detail on it. So whatever counts as announcing, then that is so. If it is lost on a pathway or roadway between two cities or two villages, then you must announce them in both, because we do not know which city the owner will be in. What if the owner comes after 1 year? Do you still have to give it back? The answer is yes, you do. If you have to return this item by post, let's say, that's going to incur expenses, of course. The expenses will be upon the owner of the wealth, not on you. What about announcing the item? If that incurs expenses, for example, announcing it in newspapers and so on, then who foots the bill there? Well, again, we say the same thing. The owner of the wealth must pay for the announcement. Why? Because it was for his advantage. It was not for the benefit of the announcer. So in both of these situations, the owner foots the bill. So that is for the returning and the announcing. Now with the sheep, the Prophet does give permission to take ownership of it, where he says it's either for you or for your brother or for the wolf, because the sheep is unable to defend itself and it's vulnerable. So you do take possession of the sheep. However, the announcement has not been made mention of, and we say that you do have to announce it, just like in the first case. But of course with a sheep, you need to pay for it, for its food and its upkeep. So who foots the bill there? Again, we say the same thing. The owner, if he comes to collect the sheep, he will pay for it. So the finder will be reimbursed by the owner. But it may well be that the finder does not want to pay for it because it's a burden. Well, we say in this case, sell it, keep the price, and if the owner comes, you will give the price to him. One might ask, but how is it that he is selling the sheep when he does not own it? And the answer here is, this is out of darura, necessity. And then besides, it's for the benefit of the owner. It would be a similar case where somebody dies and leaves behind some wealth, but this is a type of wealth that may become ruined if left for too long. And he cannot send it to the inheritors straight away, because maybe he's in a different country or whatever else the reason may be. In this case, he can sell it and give the price to the inheritors. Again, he's selling something that does not belong to him, but it is for the benefit of the true owner. And it is out of necessity, to save wealth. When asked about the camel, the Prophet became annoyed. How can you ask about such a camel? He is in no danger, and he is able to feed and drink himself, and his owner will come and take him. So you should leave such animals alone. However, some sensible thought needs to be exercised. If this stray camel is in a place where there are many bandits or many beasts of prey that may ambush this camel, so you feel that it's in a place in which its life is in danger, then yes, you can take this camel and announce it. just like the other lost property items. And if you do not want to spend on it, then you can sell it and give the price to the owner if or when he comes. What about this question? For all lost property items, whether it be just items or the sheep or the camel, if he hands it over to the authority which looks after lost property items, would this suffice? The answer is yes. And of course, this is one of the responsibilities of the rulers. Here's another question. If he picks it up, knowing that he will have to announce it, and then he regrets picking it up because he does not want to announce it anymore, can he return back to the place where he found it and return the item there? The answer is no. And if he does do that, and the item gets lost or gets taken by a thief, then he will be responsible, meaning the finder will be responsible. If he did not know that he has this responsibility and he returns it back to its place, then it can be argued that he is not at fault and he is allowed to do that because he did not know of the ruling. However, better than that, we say return it to the Baytul Mal, because they are the authority and they will be able to look after it. Most scholars say that the Luqata of the Haram of Mecca has the same ruling as the Luqata of anywhere else. And some other scholars say that no, with the Luqata of the Haram of Mecca, you have to forever announce it and it never comes in your possession. So after 1 year, normally the Luqata comes into your possession. But as for the Luqata of the Haram, it never comes into your possession due to the hadith, لا تحل ساقطتها إلا لمنشد. You're not allowed to pick up any lost items in the Haram except for the one who will announce it. Now, who would want to announce it forever on? So this hadith is there to discourage people from picking up the Luqata of the Haram, so that the one who drops it will simply return to the exact place where he dropped it and he should be able to find it there. But again, with the Luqata of the Haram, if you fear that if you leave it there, some irresponsible person will take it, then you pick it up and give it to the authority. There's a strange ruling given by the Hanbali ulama in this matter. They say that during this year, if the item is damaged without any ta'addi or tafreet on the part of the finder, then he does not stand as a guarantor because he is an ameen, and an ameen does not stand as a guarantor if he is not guilty of ta'addi or tafreet. But they say after the year elapses and the item is destroyed, then he does stand as a guarantor, even if it is without ta'addi or tafreet. They say because now, after the year, the item comes under his possession. And it seems to us that, if anything, it ought to be the other way around. But it appears that a more sensible opinion would be that he never stands as a guarantor if the item is damaged without ta'addi, which is overstepping the limit, or doing something which you ought not to do, and without tafreed, which is gross negligence. So that is not doing what you ought to do. And we say this because in all cases, before the elapsing of a year and after, in all cases, the Sharia has permitted this item to come into the safekeeping of the finder. And so therefore he ought to be an ameen in all cases. Let's take a look at the next chapter about the Luqata of the Hajj, the one performing the Hajj. From Abdurrahman ibn Uthman al-Taymi, he says that the Prophet forbade the Luqata of the pilgrim. And also from Zayd ibn Khalid al-Juhani, that the Prophet said, Man awa dallatan fahuwa dall ma lam yu'arrifha. Whoever takes possession of a lost article, then he himself is lost, unless he advertises it. The Luqata of the Hajj, what is intended by this is what is inside the Haram, not what is outside the Haram. As for the second narration, about the one who picks up a lost animal, then he himself is lost, meaning misguided, unless he announces it. Then this agrees with the first hadith of the first chapter, that you have to announce the lost item, even if it is an animal. Let's take the next chapter about the prohibition to milk an animal without the permission of its owner. From Ibn Umar, that the Prophet said, لا يحلبن أحد ماشية أحد إلا بإذنه أيحب أحدكم أن تؤتى مشربته فتكسر خزانته فينتقل طعامه إنما تخزن لهم ذروع مواشيهم أطعمتهم فلا يحلبن أحد ماشية أحد إلا بإذنه. One of you should not milk the animal of another person without his permission. Would you want that your chamber be raided and the containers be broken and the food be removed? The udders of the animal store the food of the owner. So therefore, no one should milk the animal of another person except with his permission. We take from this vital hadith the if you see an animal in the land, then you are not allowed to milk its udder until you seek the permission of the owner. So this applies to a sheep or to a cow and to a camel and so on. Permission or the idhn can be of two types. Firstly, a lafzi or a verbal permission, that is just simply giving a verbal permission. Or the permission can also be urfi, in the customs. So it could be customary that a person passing along the way, a journeyman, comes to a sheep and he is able to milk the sheep and no one's going to object. However, we say with this type of permission, it needs to be a constant and continuous customary practice. It must not be the case that some people will allow it and others would not. No, rather it must be a constant and continuous customary practice in which no one will object. And this is what we say for all permissions which are urfi, by custom. Otherwise, you do not act in accordance with this custom if it is not continuous and accepted by the whole society. So if it be the case, for example, that only the rich people will not mind you milking their sheep, but everyone else will, then this is not a idhn urfi, a customary permission. We also learn a great practice for teaching others. When you're teaching them a concept, give them a parable of that which they can relate to, as the Prophet does here with somebody's chamber, a small room in which his provisions are stored. Would you want somebody breaking into this room of yours, this chamber, and taking the food? Of course you do not. So therefore do not do it to others. And the udder of the animal is like this chamber which stores the food. However, if we have, let's say, a journeyman who is forced out of hunger to milk the animal and he does not have permission, then he can do so, but upon him would be to pay the owner if he demands it. Let's take the next chapter about entertaining the guest. From Abu Shuraih al-Khuza'i, that the Prophet ﷺ said, الضيافة ثلاثة أيام وجائزته يوم وليلة ولا يحل لرجل مسلم أن يقيم عند أخيه حتى يؤثمه. قالوا يا رسول الله وكيف يؤثمه؟ قال يقيم عنده ولا شيء له يقريه به. The Prophet says that the period that a guest can stay at the host's house is 3 days. And of these 3 days, the first day and night, the guest must be entertained with the best food and drink. And it is not halal for a Muslim man to stay at his brother's place until he makes the brother, meaning the host, into a sinner. They asked him, how does he make him sin? And the Prophet replies that the guest stays with him for so long that the host does not have anything to entertain the guest with, so that the host runs out of provision. Back in the day, they did not have hotels and bed and breakfast and so on, and so the guest coming from outside the city would need a place to stay. And so we find in this hadith, the Sharia gives us a firm recommendation to entertain the guest. The scholars have said that in those places in which there are hotels and bed and breakfast and so on, you do not need to entertain the guest, and that it is not obligatory. And that it is only obligatory in those places in which there are no bed and breakfasts or hotels and so on. However, even if we adopt this opinion, what would we say if a person comes from outside the city wanting to stay with you? So he asks you to entertain him as a guest. Would we refuse him? Well, it does not seem to be in accordance with the character of the mu'min, neither in accordance with this hadith, that we would refuse him and tell him to go and stay at a hotel. Rather, good character dictates to us, taking inspiration from this hadith, that we accept him as a guest. If it is the case that you cannot accept him as a guest because you're going to be out of the house, because you have other work or appointment and so on, then it would make sense to give him money so that he may be able to buy food for himself and a place to stay. That is, if he does not have money himself. We find that the guest has the right to stay for 3 days and nights, of which the first day and night he has the right to be given the best type of food and drink. The other 2 days he can be given something which is normal. Although he can stay more if it is by mutual consent, however, the Prophet is telling us to be careful, because the guest must not stay so long that he annoys the host, whereas the host may be too embarrassed to tell him to get out. And you may end up with a situation that the host does not have anything to entertain the guest with. And it could come to a point where the host hates the guest and does not give him what the guest needs. And this is a sin, so the guest should not make the host sinful. In another hadith of the chapter, from Uqba ibn Amir, he said, we said to the Prophet, you send us out on a journey and we arrive at a people who do not take us in as guests. So what do you say about this? And the Prophet said, إن نزلتم بقوم فأمروا لكم بما ينبغي للضيف فاقبلوا. If you descend on a people and they order for you what is befitting for a guest, then accept it from them. فإن لم يفعلوا فخذوا منهم حق الضيف الذي ينبغي لهم. But if they do not give you your rights as a guest, then take from them on a reasonable basis what is fitting for a guest. This narration is very similar to the narration of Hind, who complained to the Prophet about Abu Sufyan. And the Prophet told her to take from his wealth on a reasonable basis for yourself and for your children, and we have passed by that hadith. This hadith has the same thread running through it. These are people who ought to be giving you, but they do not, so you can take from them. And this is the mas'alatul dhafar. When you take from a people's wealth without their knowing it, when they owe you wealth. And we say that this can be done as long as the rights are well known. So it cannot be done when the rights are not well known. For example, if somebody owes you £100, it is not well known amongst everyone that he owes you £100. Rather, this is a private matter between you and him. Whereas, contrast this with the rights of the wife over the husband, and the rights of the guest over the host. And these rights are well known. So you can do that on a reasonable basis. In this hadith, we say yes, you can take from their wealth as long as this does not lead to fights and so on. So as long as it does not lead to any corruption. However, we can make a little exception here if your right is pertaining to the exact wealth, such as, for example, you deposit a computer with somebody and he is rejecting that you ever deposited the computer with him. Now this computer is a very specific item and your rights are pertaining to that very particular item. So in that case, you are allowed to take this item from him, because this is a specific item which your rights are pertaining to. It's not like saying £100, because the £100 could be this set of notes, or that set of notes, or the other set of notes. It is not a particular item, whereas the computer is a very specific and particular item. It's the same thing with if someone usurps your wealth. Maybe your land, maybe your house, maybe your computer, maybe your car, whatever. Your rights are pertaining to that very specific item. So if you are able to, you can take it from him. Let us take the next chapter about spending surplus wealth of yours for your brother. From Abu Sa'id al-Khudri, he says, whilst we were on a journey with the Prophet, a man came on his mount and began to stare left and right. To this the Prophet said, "Man kana ma'ahu fadlu dhahrin falya'ud bihi ala man la dhahra lah." Whoever has any spare riding animal, then he should give it to the one who does not have any. وَمَنْ كَانَ لَهُ فَضْلٌ مِنْ زَادٍ فَلْيَعُدْ بِهِ عَلَى مَنْ لَا زَادَ لَهُ. And whoever has surplus provision, then let him give it to the one who has no provision. And he says that the Prophet mentioned all these different types of wealth until we began to think that none of us has any right over his surplus wealth. This man mentioned in the hadith who looks left and right, he did not have any provision. He did not have any food to eat, but he was on a riding animal. So notice how the Prophet says, whoever has excess riding animal, then give it to the one who has no animal. Yet this man who is needy, who is looking left and right, he had a riding animal. So why would the Prophet make mention of a riding animal? And the answer to this lies in the deep thoughtfulness of the Prophet ﷺ, from the excellence of his character. The Prophet did not want to embarrass that man. And that is the answer. Because if the Prophet from the very first instance said, whoever has some surplus food, then give it to the one who has not any food, then this man, looking left and right, will immediately know that the Prophet is referring to him, that he is the one who is needy. And in a group or a congregation, if you realize that somebody is singling you out as the needy person, then will you not feel embarrassed? The answer is, of course you would. So, to avoid this embarrassment, the Prophet ﷺ did not make mention of the zad, of the provisions first. He made mention of the riding animal. So ponder over how thoughtful the Prophet ﷺ is. Now here the Prophet is ordering a charity, so he's making it obligatory. Normally you cannot order somebody to give charity. You can order them to give zakah, that's obvious, but not normal charity. But here we have to say this is a matter of darura. You had to impose this charity on people. the Muslims of the communist type mentality, the Ishtirakiyin, may take this hadith to promote their communism, that the wealth must be evenly distributed between the people. And this is the emblem or the specific quality of people who have a disease in their heart, is that they seek out the mutashabihat, those hadith which could be interpreted this way or that way, such as in this case. No, we say it is not the people who are going to distribute the wealth. Allah Jalla wa Ala distributes wealth. He says in Surah Al-Zukhruf, أَهُمْ يَقْسِمُونَ رَحْمَةَ رَبِّكَ نَحْنُ قَسَمْنَا بَيْنَهُمْ مَعِيشَتَهُمْ فِي الْحَيَاةِ الدُّنْيَا وَرَفَعْنَا بَعْضَهُمْ فَوْقَ بَعْضٍ دَرَجَاتٍ لِيَتَّخِذَ بَعْضُهُمْ بَعْضًا سُخْرِيَّةً وَرَحْمَةُ رَبِّكَ خَيْرٌ مِّمَّا يَجْمَعُونَ. Is it they who divide the mercy of your Rabb? Nay, it is we who portion out their livelihood in this world, and we raise some of them above others, so that some may employ others for their work. But the mercy of your Rabb is better than the wealth which they amass. The next chapter, when the provisions run out, then you should pool your resources together. From Ayyas ibn Salama, from his father, who said, we set out on an expedition with the Prophet. We faced hardship in obtaining provision, and we decided to slaughter some of our riding animals. And the Prophet commanded us to pool our provisions together. So we spread a leather mat and collected the provisions on it. I measured how much that was, meaning the length and the width of the mat, and I measured that it was about as large, such that a goat could sit on it. He says we were 1,400 people, yet still we were fully satisfied and filled our bags with provisions. Then the Prophet said, is there any water for the wudu? Then a man came with a small bucket containing some water. He threw it in a basin, and all 1,400 people performed wudu with plenty of water. Then afterwards there came 8 people, and they said, is there any water for the wudu? And the Prophet said that the water for wudu has run out. So this story is one of the miracles of the Prophet, an ayah of prophethood. How is it that a mat on which a goat can sit, and you put provisions on it, and 1,400 people eat a plenty from it? That is an ayah of prophethood. And likewise, with just a bucket of water, 1,400 people performing wudu, that simply does not happen. Now, even though such an instance is not likely to happen after the Prophet, unless it is a karama from the awliya of Allah Jalla wa Ala, we still say that gathering together to eat food is from the blessings. It will produce blessing. And in Sunan Abi Dawud, the companions complained to the Prophet that we eat but we are not full. The Prophet asked them, perhaps you eat separately? They said yes. And the Prophet said, اجتمعوا على طعامكم وذكروا اسم الله تعالى يبارك لكم فيه. Gather together for your food and mention the name of Allah Ta'ala, it will be blessed for you. Let's take a few more points of benefit. If the owner of the lost property comes and claims his wealth, he just needs to describe the item, and if he does that, he takes the wealth. We would not burden him to provide any other evidence. And after a year, you can make use of it as you wish, as if it were your possession. However, if the owner does come back even after a year, you owe him that wealth, or the like thereof, if you have consumed it. Also, with regards to the diyafa, he says you should not stay so long so as to make him an athim, a sinner. Actually, one might ask, but if he has nothing to give the guest, then how is he a sinner? Because it's not his fault, and sin is when it's your fault. Other riwayat say yuhrij instead of yu'thim. So this is the way we would understand it. The guest is not turning him into a sinner as such, but he is making ihraj, which is to embarrass someone. So a guest stays at your house, you do not have enough to give him. You're going to feel embarrassed, or at least feel like you're a sinner because you're not entertaining the guest. Okay, let's end with some review questions. So question number 1. What must be done if you pick up a lost property for which the owner is likely to come back looking for? Question number 2. How long can you stay as a guest in the house of the host? Question number 3. Explain what we mean by the mas'alatul dhafar,